The Toronto Raptors this season is finally over, so in today's video I want to answer how a season that started with so much hope and expectation finished with so much disappointment and despair that it turned into one of the worst seasons in franchise history. Let's get into it. Typically when it comes to the end of an NBA season, it's like disappointing that the season is over. I love basketball, I love the Raptors, I love watching Raptors basketball, but I didn't really love it for a lot of this NBA season. And instead of the season being over and thinking, wow, already game 82, wow, already the end of the regular season for the NBA, this season, it was a slog to get through this season. It felt like, man, when is 82 going to come? When is game 82 going to come? And finally, when it got here, there was a sense of relief for myself that it was over. We could move on, hopefully, to brighter pastures in future seasons, and hopefully changes will come in this offseason to rectify the issues that went on in this season. But it's important to acknowledge, in my opinion, looking back on this season, how things spun out of control so much for this team. Because of course there are some injury excuses, but those were more so later on in the season. When you look at the start of the season for the Raptors, this team had aspirations of making the playoffs. At the very least, this team should have been in an NBA play-in tournament position, but they were nowhere near in the end, despite having a high-quality roster seemingly to start the season. Well, before we go any further, I want to let you guys know and remind you guys that this is Amateur Sports, a YouTube channel completely dedicated to Toronto Raptors content, whether it be for the regular season or for the offseason as well. With so much content on the way, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. And if you enjoyed this particular video, make sure you do drop a like as well. But let's look at that roster to start the season here for the Raptors, because they struggled out the gate. Like, yes, they won their first game of the season at home against the Minnesota Timberwolves, but they played really poorly in that game. The Timberwolves were just worse than the Raptors in that game, but the Raptors didn't really deserve that win, and that win followed with a losing streak, and the Raptors were up above 500 for one game and were never there for the rest of the season. And that was a roster that had Pascal Siakam coming off of an all-star season, still close to an all-NBA caliber player. It had Scottie Barnes, who was an all-star this year. It had OG Anunoby, one of the elite 3-and-D players in the NBA. Like, Raptors fans, we've known how good OG Anunoby is, but finally the rest of the NBA knows as well at the end of this season. Jakob Poeltl's a high-quality starting NBA center, a very good rim protector, and Dennis Schroeder is a fine point guard. To have for your team. You had Gary Trent Jr. coming off the bench, who would start for a lot of NBA teams. Like, that was a good roster. That was a quality roster. There were a lot of different tools there. Now, you could talk about the roster construction. You could talk about the deeper portions of the bench, which were not very good for the Raptors at the time. You could talk about how the half-court offense was an issue because of the floor spacing overall. Yes, but in the end, there was a lot of talent on that roster. There was a lot of talent with that team. Like, do you know how many front offices would love to work with a core of Siakam, Barnes, Poeltl, and Anunoby? Like, you know how many front offices would want to work with a team like that? The Raptors had that less than a year ago on their roster, but things fell apart seemingly so quickly. But at the same time, this season really started to drag on. So what were the issues to start the season for that Raptors team that had high quality talent, as I said? Because up until OG Anunoby was traded right before the new year, that roster of players was 12-20. So it wasn't as if the Raptors made the trades, got worse, had injuries, got worse, and that's why the season ended up where it was, 25-57, well short of the play-in tournament. I know the Raptors tanked at the end, but they were short of the play-in tournament when they decided to start tanking. And the reason they started tanking is they knew they couldn't get to the play-in tournament. So it wasn't as if the trades happened, we got worse, injuries happened, we got worse. The team was bad out the gates with a good roster. How did that happen? Well, we've talked about the roster construction, the lack of floor spacing overall. That turned into a difficult half-court offense, which had been bad for, the years prior for the Raptors as well. But we brought in a head coach in Darko Rajakovic, who we had hoped would rectify a lot of those issues on the offensive end, which just did not happen at all. What the Raptors had in previous years and had the year before when they did make the NBA's play-in tournament, and what we were banking on working for us this season as well, was the defensive side of the ball. You had OG Anunoby, one of the premier elite top-tier defenders in the NBA. Siakam, who's a good to great defender. Barnes, who kind of turned into a great defender at the start of the season. Poeltl, who's an excellent rim protector. And Schroeder, who at the very least is a neutral. He is not a negative defender for this team. Like, that team should have accidentally just shown up and been a top 10 defense, but it was nowhere near. So the Raptors were broken in the half court. They were not executing anything like the expectations would suggest on the defensive end, and it turned into a bad team. Offensively, it felt for a lot of the times that Darko was trying to coach a team that he didn't have. Yes, there were some issues for spacing. Yes, there were problems, but there was also a ton of talent on the offensive end. The most efficient offensive set the Raptors had all season, judging by the eye test and judging by the statistics, was Pascal Siakam post-ups. And it felt like Darko fought so hard not to ever use that play. Like, the plays that would work, it felt as though he would refuse outright to go to Siakam post-ups, even though that was clearly the best offense for the Raptors. I'm not saying every possession force-feed Siakam in the post, but it wasn't used nearly enough. What was used way too much was Dennis Schroeder touches. Dennis Schroeder touches, especially in fourth quarter situations and clutch situations. Like, you have a team with Scotty Barnes and Pascal Siakam, and you're going to Dennis Schroeder in clutch situations. That just didn't make sense. So there were some problems, yes, absolutely. But there were a lot of problems that were self-inflicted, and a lot of which felt as though it was coaching staff on the offensive end for that first portion of the season. Defensively for the Raptors, it felt as though there was never really any preparation that went into games. The amount of games the Raptors went down by 10 points in the first half. I think we got to the halfway point of this season, and in over half of the games played for the Raptors, they were down by 10 or more points in the first half. And for a good chunk of those 10-point deficits in the first half, a good chunk of those were in the first quarter as well. So the Raptors consistently came into games ill-equipped to play against their opponent. They had poor preparation and execution on defense and did not score. Turned into a bad team. A bad team that was masked by the good players and ended up winning 12 of the first 32 games. But that's when the front office decided to make some changes. What's great about the position that the Raptors are currently in right now, which they weren't a year ago, is that there's a sense of direction. Raptors fans, front office, coaching staff, they believe in the core going forward. There's a good group of young players tied to this roster for the future. That was not the case at this time last season. That was not the case right at the turn of the year when the Raptors decided to trade OG and Anunoby in exchange for RJ Barrett and Immanuel Quickley. Immanuel Quickley was super excited about, wasn't as excited about RJ Barrett. That quickly changed. RJ Barrett has been sensational for the Raptors. Immanuel Quickley has been great for the Raptors. And when those two arrived to the team, it added on to the floor spacing. The roster maybe wasn't as good, but it made a whole lot more sense, and it was a lot easier for Darko Rajakovic to come up with his offensive schemes to utilize that roster. There was a bit of an uptick period then for the Raptors, who started to win some games, who started to at least perform a whole lot better. The games became a whole lot more watchable for Raptors fans. Those first 32 games were an utter nightmare to watch for this team. But as that honeymoon phase started to fade off, the defensive problems once again came through for the team. Still underutilizing Pascal Siakam with the team. Those wins started to taper off, which eventually became the Pascal Siakam trade to the Indiana Pacers, where the Raptors very much got worse with that trade. Got better, hopefully, for the future, but got worse with that trade. Those trades made sense. Look, OG was on an expiring contract. Siakam was on an expiring contract. You did not want to play with those guys in free agency. It was right to make those trades. Overall, based on the situation, that OG and Anunoby trade was sensational. The Siakam trade was okay, underwhelming, but still decent in recouping assets for the future. But at that point, the Raptors, they were already struggling. They already were underperforming. They were already off the pace to make the NBA's play-in tournament. And I was calling for the tank before the All-Star break. It wasn't like after the All-Star break where it was like, okay, no choice but the tank. It had been clear for a good, close to a month before the Raptors actually committed to a tank that this team wasn't going anywhere. They should focus on that draft pick. Now, it didn't cost us. Even at that point, the best case scenario would be catch the Grizzlies in the standings, finish top 6 in the reverse standings, and give yourself a 45% chance of keeping that pick. That was executed in the end, and that was accomplished in the end. So no harm in that situation, but it wasn't, once again, as if the injuries were the reason the Raptors started to tank. I mean, it was the reason. Scotty Barnes got injured. Jakob Poeltl got injured. They missed the rest of the season, but it was pretty apparent even before those injuries that the Raptors should be tanking. Those injuries just made it completely, extraordinarily, way too obvious for the front office to ignore anymore, and thus the tank happened. Even amidst the tank, like, I know they were trying to lose. I know the roster was bad. It still felt like they weren't playing well enough still. Like, I know they're bad. I know that the team wasn't good, but it still felt like they had a bit more to give that they were not giving. And that really was the theme of the season. Yes, we know about these problems. but they still shouldn't be this bad. We know that some things should be bad, but it shouldn't be this bad. That was the entire season for the Raptors, and it was such a consistent degree of making excuses for the team. And granted, a lot of those excuses were warranted, and a lot of them which, should have been recognized. They were recognized by myself, but for like the entire 82-game season, acknowledging where things are bad for this team is okay. But it's also important to understand that as bad as some of these things are, the team should still not be at this level of bad. They won 25 games this season. In the Tampa tank season, the Raptors won 27 games. Except it was a shortened season with only 72 games. They won 27 out of 72 games. The Raptors this season won 25 out of 82 games. And if you look back at the roster for that Tampa season, where they had every excuse in the world not to play well, that roster was worse than this one. For even with the injuries, that roster was worse than what we were seeing from the roster from this season. And that team had 0 home games. They played every home game in Tampa Bay. So they had every excuse and still did okay, all things considered. This Raptors team did everything but be okay, to be honest. Nowhere near okay for this team. So amidst the tank, it was a real struggle to watch. There was no interesting young players coming up that were playing well, that, gave hope. Like Grady Dick, his development this season is one of the bright points for sure. But, there was no fun 10-day contracts. There was no fun young guys coming up playing well that we could hope on for the future. It was just all doom and despair amidst that losing streak and amidst losing 57 games here. The 5th most losses in franchise history, most since 2010, 2011, and most before that was 2002, 2003, early 2000s. Like, this is just not the norm for the Raptors to lose this many games. And it should not be, we should not be at a point where we grow accustomed to these things. For the entirety of the season, it just started to feel like Raptors fans very annoyingly were getting accustomed to losing, getting accustomed to being bad. Like, you should not get comfy with losing. This team is underperforming, even with how bad they are and how bad they've been and how bad the roster is. They should not be this bad. We should not get comfy with the fact that they are losing games. They lost their largest home loss in franchise history at the start of March to the Pelicans before they even started tanking. The good players were healthy for that game. Then they started tanking. A month later, they topped it. They lost an even greater amount at home to the New York Knicks. Then a week after that, they had the worst loss period in franchise history. So many records were set for the Raptors this season. They nearly had the record for largest losing streak. They did set the largest home loss in franchise history twice in a month. And then also in that month, they had the largest loss period in franchise history. It should never have gotten to that point of being that bad. Granted, there are excuses. Yes, 100%. But there's not going to be those same excuses next season. The offensive players are in place. The roster is in place for the current coaching staff to execute from day one. They have these players they've been working with. They have the offensive style kind of down. These schemes kind of down. They want to use next season. There should be no excuses there. And whatever needs to be done in this offseason to sort out the defense needs to be done. Like, I get it. There's not a lot of great defensive players here, but once again, I'm going to say, as bad as it could have been, it should have been, it was even worse. So the Raptors need to find a way to execute at some degree defensively, because if not, they're going to be hopeless next season. And next season, there should be expectation. Not hope, but expectation that this team is at the very least in a play-in tournament position. And at the very least is challenging and being competitive in these games in the final week of the NBA season. Because this season has been a complete wash since the middle of February. 2 full months of absolute useless basketball pretty much played by this team. Yes, again, there was those excuses for this season. Not enough to justify a 25-57 record, but there were excuses. Once again, going to reiterate, there are not going to be those excuses for next season. So, in the draft, sort out bringing more talent into this team. In free agency, sort out filling the cracks in the roster. Get the defensive help you need. Get the additional floor spacing that you might want. And start to execute once again next season. Because the Raptors, it's been a decade of success. We're spoiled. We're greedy. Yes. But that's what we can become accustomed to in Toronto at this point. That's what we should become accustomed to with a front office that has somebody as talented in their position like Masai Ujiri, who, started to turn me a little bit this season back in favor of himself. but we got to get things sorted this offseason. Losing cannot become the norm in Toronto once again, because the further you dig down, the deeper you go in that hole, the harder it is to climb out. Get things right in this offseason. Start to turn things around. And let's hope for and expect those brighter pastures for the future. What did you make of this NBA season? Was it as bad as I said it was? Were there more excuses than I gave the Raptors credit for? Give me your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below, because that's it for me for today. Drop a like if you enjoyed this video. Subscribe to the channel. Help us on the road to 18,000 subs. And we'll see you again next time for another video.